Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. I love this point where we're right at the edge of autumn, with summer days and autumnal nights butting up against each other, and there's still masses going on in the garden, and still time to plant for a harvest later on in the year. I've got some pak choi here, in fact, two different types of pak choi. We've got the red leaf and the green leaf. They certainly add to the texture and the colour of the vegetable garden. And when you grow in plugs like this, it does mean that planting out is really easy, because the raised beds, the soil's nice and light and free draining, and you simply make a hole, pop it in. Pak choi grows fairly quickly, so you need to give it reasonable space. About 6 inches will do the job. And I normally harvest them quite young so that they will grow back. You can get 2 or 3 cuttings off these. And if you have a cloche or a fleece for the worst of the weather, they should last right through winter. And if you haven't grown any vegetables from seed yourself, don't feel left out, because nowadays garden centres sell quite a wide variety of young veg in plugs. So if you go and buy a tray, you can plant them out this weekend or in a container, and that way you can have really fresh, delicious, healthy vegetables growing in your garden for the next couple of months at least. Now, coming up on tonight's programme. Head gardener Alan Power takes us behind the scenes at one of the country's greatest landscape gardens, Stourhead in Wiltshire. Carol tackles another of your troublesome plant problems, and this week she's looking at how to deal with heavy clay soil. And we visit a back garden in Essex that has made the most of its tiny space. And I shall be potting up spring flowering bulbs and pruning my summer fruiting raspberries. Come on, Hooks. When we prepare for high summer, we do all our planting and moving and plants around in spring, or at least most of us do, because that's when we re-engage with the garden. But spring flowering plants start their growing season now. And I'm going to add 3 plants here to the spring garden. The first plant I'm going to put in here is a helleborus. Helleborus are fantastic in March and April. But the colours, as they hybridise, can get very muddy. And if you freshen them, that does add a sparkle to the spring garden. This is a variety with a slightly improbable name of Helleborus ericsmithii. And it's a hybrid called Winter Sunshine. It's got really good silvery foliage and lovely burgundy-coloured stems. This will flower in December in a mild year and carry on flowering right through to March or even April. And I'm going to put it here, and the soil is rich and good, which is good for helleborus because these are very long-lived plants. It's worth taking trouble to give them a good start in life. They're adaptable. They'll grow in most soils, and they tend to have a reputation for being plants for shade and woodland, but actually they grow very well in full sun. Light shade is perfectly good, full sun, but not deep, dark shade. You can see the roots of this are fairly matted. I'm just going to break them a bit. Just scrape your fingernails over the roots. And what that does is force them to repair and regrow. And as they regrow, instead of staying within the pot, they will grow outwards into the soil. And that will help it get established quicker. Whereas if you just pop this in straight out the pot, it'll stay in the formation it was in for ages. Plant at the same height that it's in the pot. What helleborus like best is a nice, free-draining, loamy soil. Having said that, they will cope with chalk, they'll cope with clay. The one thing they're not so happy on is light sand. You do need to beef that up with some compost. That will grow up a couple of feet tall and really reliable and solid. Some hellebores are a little bit temperamental, but this is a good doer. So there we have white flush pink. Now I'm going for the blues. This is a pulmonaria. It's pulmonaria blue ensign, and it's the bluest of all the pulmonarias. Of course, they're recognizable by their spotted leaves. That's why they're called lungworts, because they look a little bit like a lung, and they were used in medieval medicine to treat coughs and diseases of the lung. Not that they necessarily were very efficacious. This is very much a woodland plant. It does its best in light, deciduous shade. Nice root system, no problems at all, and just pop that in the ground. Nothing could be easier. The third plant in this spring trio is Corydalis flexuosa China blue. And is a blue quite unlike almost any other plant. It's icy pale blue, but really strong. And as someone memorably described it, the flowers are like shoals of blue fishes swimming through and above the foliage. To call it a spring plant is a little bit disingenuous, because actually it will go on flowering into July. And then it dies back and will start again in about April. Now this likes some sun, so I'm putting it on this side because there's more sunlight coming from over there. It's rhizomous, so it spreads. And given the right conditions, this will spread and cover an area about 1 metre wide. So really good at the front of a border, giving you not only colour, but also this lovely, delicate, dancing foliage. So we'll pop that in like that and push around it. Now, I will have to water this in really well, because that could not be drier. But that's no problem. And it's always a treat, it seems to me, to be planting at this time of year. We're so used to planting bulbs in September and October, but herbaceous perennials for spring are far better planted now too. And it does mean that you leapfrog winter. You start thinking of next year and the joys it's going to bring, rather than regretting the demise of summer. And the spring garden here at Longmeadow is a small part of it. It's a slither that looks great for part of the year. But some gardens do spring on a grand scale. And over the last year, we've been visiting Alan Power, the head gardener, at Stourhead. Stourhead is one of our great landscape gardens. And we've been looking behind the scenes and seeing how they prepare for each season. And today, we go as spring begins.
Created in the mid-18th century by banker Henry Hoare, the Magnificent, Stourhead is one of the world's great landscape gardens, used by its owner to express his views about the world he lived and travelled in. The estate stayed in the Hoare family until 1946, when it was given to the National Trust, who have looked after it ever since. The house is wonderful. It's the heartbeat of the estate. It's where the Hoare family would have dined, lived their life, and made decisions. Decisions like this, creating one of the finest landscape gardens in Europe, if not in the world. And I've been head gardener here for the last 13 years, looking after this masterpiece and doing the work that was done historically, looking after what Henry the Magnificent created in the 18th century. Originally, the gardens and designed landscape of over 2,500 acres were created and maintained by a team of over 50 staff. Now they are looked after by me, 6 full-time gardeners and a handful of volunteers. Something we spend a lot of time doing, and especially in spring, is looking after the lawns. They're the stage that the plants sit on. Really important to keep the lawns good. And what Mark is doing today is he's just using the slit-tine spiker to release some of the tension out of the lawn. And by doing that, it allows the nutrients and the moisture to soak through to the root zone of the grass. Without doing that, the moisture just sits on the surface and the lawn will struggle for the rest of the season. And although we do it on a grand, massive scale here, it's the same in your own garden. If you've got a desire line, your favourite route to the shed to get the lawnmower, whatever it is, just by using the garden fork and spiking through that area of the grass will allow the nutrients in and keep the lawn healthy for the rest of the season. Around the lake, Henry Hoare designed and constructed some amazing architectural features, like the Pantheon, a temple dedicated to all gods, which was inspired by the Pantheon in Rome and is the largest garden building at Stourhead. And this is the Temple of Flora, built in 1743, the first temple that Henry constructed in the garden. And he dedicated to Flora, the Roman goddess of flowers and spring, and it's essential that she's in the garden. But above the door, there's a Latin inscription, and it simply says, keep away, those of you who are profane, keep away. And that was Henry's way of politely asking people to be in the right spirit as they entered his garden and prepare for something magical and very, very special. Quite often people will look at a garden like Stourhead and see it as a finished masterpiece, the finished article. But something that we do as a garden team is try and make sure that the detail within that masterpiece is as interesting as possible and appropriate as possible. So this is hibiscus Jeanne d'Arc, a variety that existed in the collection here at Stourhead in the 1920s into the 1930s. But I reckon because of the changing in the property and the lack of care and attention at the time, plants like this were lost. Although it looks a little bit miserable in the spring, it doesn't come into leaf till slightly later. It has these fantastic white flowers, almost out of scale with the shrub when it's young. And it really draws your attention, and that's the detail I'm after in the garden. You can be looking at huge trees, you can be looking at big, magnificent rhododendrons, and then your attention is drawn down to something as dainty and as delicate as this hibiscus. So it's very exciting to be putting these back into the collection. And this Acer ozakazuki, it's a beautiful plant, a really nice specimen, and it took some work to find this, because I don't necessarily want to just introduce modern hybrids into the collection, because then that's not appropriate to the place. So getting the right plant is what's very important for the collection. So the Acer palmatum ozakazuki at this stage and in this condition is exactly what I was after. Stourhead has a fabulous collection of trees and shrubs introduced into the garden from all over the world, and springtime is one of the best times of year to see them. The rhododendrons are starting to come into flower, and we've got hundreds of different varieties dotted around the landscape. But there is one rhododendron that has suffered a little bit. Working in a landscape garden is quite often a big maintenance task and battling against the season. And this rhododendron behind me lost that battle a couple of years ago when it blew over. But what it did do was open up a really wonderful opportunity and a little bit of a surprise in the garden. And it set seed. This wonderful array of rhododendron auriculatum seeds behind me. And that's quite a rare thing to happen. Rhododendrons don't seed naturally everywhere, but obviously the conditions here were perfect at the time. And it's a late summer flowering rhododendron, heavily scented. Really attracts your senses in at that time of the year. Big white trumpets of flowers. And it's called auriculatum, and it's one of the ones that's easier to remember for me because at the base of the leaf, you've got these little wonderful curves that come into the leaf petiole, and it's named after your auricle, your earlobe. So they look like earlobes. And that's one of the tricks I use for remembering this plant. We all have thousands of tricks as gardeners for remembering plant names. And the project that we're doing at the moment is Mark and Joe are lifting some of these seedlings. They're going to transplant them across the valley into similar conditions. And hopefully in years to come, we may well have rhododendron auriculatum Stourhead. We can do what we need to do as gardeners, but sometimes Mother Nature will throw these wonderful surprises in front of us, and that makes our day. Springtime in the garden. It is a time of big tasks, whether it's aerating the lawns, transplanting seedlings, mulching the beds. But actually what we're really doing is preparing those plants and those lawns and the garden for the months ahead. It's a very dry season that we're heading into, and that next season will be summertime.
Come on. Well, we will be returning to Stourhead next week to enjoy the full glory of Stourhead in summertime with Alan and his team. But it's back to spring, or forward to spring here, and you don't have to have a spring garden or any garden at all to enjoy spring flowers. They grow very well in pots, and my absolute favourites are the early irises. These are the Iris reticulata, Iris hysteroides group, and they have the most intense, fantastic colours. And they flower very early indeed. It can be as early as January, and they're certainly at their best in February. Now, these are plants that can be grown outside, but if, like me, you've got heavy clay, which doesn't drain very well, and wet winters, they don't like it. They absolutely must have good drainage and sunshine, which is why I'm going to give them pots. Now, as far as good drainage goes, you can add perlite to a potting mix, which does the job very well, or grit. And one of the advantages of grit is that it's heavy. It's much heavier than perlite. So if you put them in pots outside, in winter, they tend to blow over less. So I'm going to add extra grit to the seed compost. It doesn't need to be very rich. Right, I'm going to start with Iris hysteroides George. And by the way, when you go to a garden centre, you won't find packets like this. There'll be packets of 15 or 20. And they will be a lot more expensive per bulb than if you buy them in some bulk. These are packets of 100 bulbs, which you can find online. And these are small bulbs, so 100 is very easily used up, particularly if you're planting them outside. Plant them, and of course, like all bulbs, pointy end up. About an inch apart, because we don't need to worry about them getting maximum nourishment, because what we're looking for is an intense hit of colour that will last for about 3-4 weeks when we most need it. That's the point. Cover those over, label them, of course. They need to be watered and then kept reasonably dry. Don't leave them out over winter in a soggy corner in the garden waiting for them to flower, because the thing that they hate most is being too wet. What I do is put them in a cold frame that is left open, but protected from the rain. But if you don't have a cold frame, put them either in a cool conservatory or a porch, or they can be outside, but just against a dry, protecting wall. Now, if you do have a bigger container and you want to use them for bulbs, I wouldn't fill this with irises, but it is brilliant for crocus. Now, I've got snow bunting, very familiar white crocus. So, we'll just cover that hole a little bit, put plenty of compost. Crocus, again, like drainage. Again, I bought these in bulk, simply because it's much cheaper. And again, we want a mass. That may look like an extravagance, but I think a few quid spent on beautiful bulbs that will give you so much pleasure in the depths of winter, next February, early March, is worth every single penny. So we'll just cover those over. And what I am going to do with these is put a dressing of grit on top, because if that is going to stay outside rather than the iris, which will go into a cold frame, and if the rain is really heavy, it will bash it up, whereas the grit protects it. Now, obviously, you can grow anything you like in pots because you can change the soil and you can put them where they'll be most happy. But in our gardens, outside, we have to deal with problems as they are. and sometimes they're a bit more tricky to fix. But Carol has been addressing problems that you have sent in. And this week, she's looking at something that takes us right back down to earth.
Loads of you have been in contact with us on social media, asking us all sorts of questions. But one of your main concerns seems to be soil, and especially clay. We all know that heavy clay soil can be difficult to work with. And keen gardeners Elaine and her husband Dave from Buckinghamshire have unearthed just such a problem in their borders. So when you got in touch with the programme, you said you got clay. But when I'm looking at this, it doesn't look like heavy clay at all.
So underneath this topsoil is pretty much thick clay.
You get your spade in and then you hit the heavy clay.
Right.
We've planted this border behind us and it looks OK now, but we're not sure how long it's going to last. I've picked plants that seem OK, but with the clay pan at the bottom, will they last over the winter with the wet weather?
And it's this sparse bit of the border that seems to have the worst growing conditions.
We've had some plants that haven't done quite so well, such as rhododendrons, which I've lifted and moved to other areas of the garden, which are starting to get a little bit better. And then we've had some deaths, such as the wisteria.
Right. That really does look as though it's had its day, doesn't it?
I think that's finished.
It's time to get my hands dirty. Right. Oh, my goodness. Look at that.
Yeah, it's quite heavy.
If you just pick some of this up and just mould it between the hands, you can make an absolute sphere of it. You know, you can just turn it into a ball. And you've got this all the way along here.
Yeah, it's deceiving. After the first few inches, you hit this and it makes any task of planting into a long, drawn-out process.
I don't think there's going to be anything you can do to change that, unless you get a great big earth mover in here, you know, and just get rid of the lot. That's not an option here. The clay is here to stay. But why is clay so challenging? You'll often hear gardeners complaining about having heavy clay soil. It's really wet. It's very heavy and hard to work. You can't even walk on it in the winter. But what is clay? If you could see into it with a microscope, then you'd see lots and lots of tiny platelets, little flat areas side by side. Its structure makes it stick together and makes it feel like really, really heavy material. What can you do about it if you have got clay? Well, the major thing is to add lots and lots of organic matter, compost, rotted manure, bark, and you can dig it in or you can lay it right on the top where the worms will actually take it down. Although people talk about clay as a problem, it actually has huge advantages over a lot of other soils. Thin, sandy soils leach out the nutrients and the water goes straight through. If you want a really retentive, rich soil, then you couldn't do better than clay. Some plants love clay soil. I want to show Elaine what can really do well and thrive here. So these are the 3 plants that I've brought. I know you know what that is.
Yeah, it smells gorgeous.
Lovely perfume. So roses do really well in clay. That's English shrub rose, and it's called
pretty.
the Poet's Wife.
Wow.
Do you like the colour?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
This is Rodgersia aesculifolia. Now, you know folia means leaf.
Yeah.
So it's got leaves like an aesculus.
Yeah, we haven't got many plants with big leaves in this garden, so this is something quite different.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And aesculus just means horse chestnut.
Oh, well, you can see that. You can see the resemblance.
Yeah, and it'll love your clay. And this lovely clematis is Blue Angel.
You can see why it's called a Blue Angel as well.
Yeah, it is. She's divine, isn't she? It's hard work, but it's really worth it. Digging lots of organic material into your clay soil will ensure that your plants have the best chance to flourish. You can see the clay, but there's masses of this. First to be planted is the clematis. So are you going to do the honours?
I will do.
Yeah, you got that bit?
Yeah.
Now, it's well rooted, but it's not pot bound. But you can see these big, thick, they're almost sort of thong-like roots, and those will go right down, and when they hit your clay, they won't stop. Make sure that there are no air pockets in here, because you want your roots to be able to move, not just downwards into your clay, but across into the rest of your soil too. And if there's air in between, that won't happen.
Oh, OK.
Right. Well, it's got reasonable roots, but and it'll soon get going now, because it's got the addition of this lovely compost. Right. Woohoo! And he's strong and lovely roots. Yeah. It's surprising, isn't it, that a great big plant like that has got such sort of fibrous roots. It's herbaceous, so it'll dive right down to the ground for the winter.
OK.
Up it'll come in the spring. And you often see it associated with water and heavy clay, so I think it's going to love living here.
Fantastic.
There you go.
Cheers, just what we need.
Yeah.
So, what's your feeling then? Have we been of any help? Have we helped solve your problem?
Massively. It's really reassuring to know that we can improve this soil and we can plant some really nice plants and have a really pretty garden with plants that are going to thrive.
If you'd like one of our team to come and help tackle a problem in your garden, get in touch with us. And don't forget to upload a photo. Plants are amazingly adaptable, but some plants definitely do much better on clay than others. And a really good example is not spectacular, but it's very effective. Hornbeam. I've got hornbeam hedges all over Longmeadow, and it does very happily on clay soil. And in the borders, there are lots of plants to choose from. Some plants adapt better than others, but things at this time of year, like Niphophia, for example, loves clay soil. The weeping pear, very happy on clay. Buddleia doesn't mind clay. And obviously, plants like hostas relish the moisture retention that you have on clay. Here at Longmeadow, I've adapted the soil simply by a regime. And that starts, as Carol said, with adding as much organic matter as possible. And it's best to do this with mulching. You don't need to dig it in. Just put a thick mulch on in autumn and in spring, and the worms will work that in surprisingly quickly. If you can get hold of mushroom compost, it's especially good for clay, because the lime in the mushroom compost actively breaks the clay down. Horticultural grit is really good at lightening a heavy soil, but it is expensive. But what I suggest doing is certain areas where you do need really good drainage. For example, if you're growing bulbs, use grit. It's magical stuff. And finally, you just have to be patient. Do all these things, stick with it, and after about 3 or 4 years, you will notice that the soil is starting to get lighter. And after about 5 years, you have that magical thing, clay loam. And clay loam is a gardener's dream. Now, it doesn't matter what your soil is like, what the aspects are, how big your garden is or how small. You can make something special if you've got the will. And if you needed proof, we went to Essex to visit a tiny garden that is truly magical.
It starts like a painting. It's just a splash of color. And after the plant gets more and more detail, and this don't stop.
Before the garden was totally renovated, it was basically a concrete patio. I've known Fabrice for about 20 years. When I first knew him, he was living in a house down in Kent, and he totally renovated the chap's garden, and I could see he'd done a wonderful job there. Fabrice then came and stayed here, and I did say to him that I would love my garden improving. So he totally renovated the garden, as you could say, in lieu of rent.
Well, it was funny. The first night I spent in this house, I was thinking about the garden, and I was a little bit lost because this was really a very small garden. And I went to bed, and in the middle of the night, I wake up with terrible headache, and it was a plan coming in my head. On my plan, I like the fact to have different sitting area, and it makes the garden feel much bigger. The garden is an extension of the house, and actually it's the most important part of the house. On the top level, I wanted to have as much room as possible.
On the patio, it's nice to sit in the evening because you've got the sun facing you and you've still got the ambience of the garden to look at. On the next level down, we've got 2 old wooden seats.
I put the chair in each side of this level only for one reason. I detest to have a conversation with someone and to have to turn my head. I like to be face to face. And plus, we still have some room in the middle to be able to have a table and drinks, whatever. But I like to have my guests in front of me. This area, I wanted to create some sort of background and try to have a little bit of height, but to keep everything in proportion in the garden. An example, this tree, I want to keep it to a certain height, just enough to have privacy, but not to have it like a wall. Planting, I think, work in this small garden because it's quite a heavy planting. But the fact that there is different room makes it feel much bigger than it is. Like in a house, you will have a living room and a kitchen and a bedroom. It's exactly the same in the garden.
The next level down is what we call the secret area because you are quite hidden from other houses. There's a large chair in there that we call the throne, so it's just seating for one person.
I cannot imagine any garden without water because it brings peace. It is very atmospheric when we sit in the garden having conversation, watching the bird on top of the fountain. The secret area is one of my favorite spots. It's where I can forget everything that is around. The plants in this area, I really like them, particularly the colocasia. It's beautiful, and in the morning with all the drop of water, it's like little pearl floating on top. The same with the oyster.
There are several interesting items in the garden. We have 5 what we call pinnacles, which are the remains of old trees which were flooded many years ago.
For me, the pinnacles, they are a piece of art that have been created by nature, and sometimes they are the most beautiful.
I often sit here when it's pouring with rain. It's a totally different atmosphere sitting here. And I'll have a glass of wine or champagne, and it's just so relaxing to listen to the pouring rain and the running water, and maybe even see a frog come out to see me.
What makes it work, it's all bits and pieces. It's like a puzzle. They all go together, and I cannot imagine to remove one of them.
I never thought I'd have a garden like this. I mean, it's fantastic.
I love this garden because it's a place where I can breathe. It can be extremely peaceful and serene.
True.
I love that garden. And it does just show that size has absolutely nothing to do with the amount that you can both cram into a garden and also get from it. A small garden like that can give as much pleasure as rolling acres. Now, what's a good idea at this time of year is if you've got a bare piece of soil, particularly in a veg plot, I always put a layer of compost on the ground. And this does two things. One, it acts as a mulch which stops weeds growing. And two, it will work into the soil. It will gradually feed it, enrich it. So if you do want to plant in a few weeks' time, that will help. And if you want to leave it over winter, that will improve the quality and the structure of the soil ready for next spring. I'm not going to put your tennis ball on there either. Now, coming up on tonight's programme. Adam visits RHS Wisley to see their brand new exotic garden. But first, we've been celebrating our 50th anniversary all year and feeling rather proud of our ripe old age. But I have to tell you that we are mere striplings compared to Derek Saunders. And Francis went to visit him in his garden at home in Norfolk.
Gardening is for all ages. Some of us come to it early in life and other people come to it later in life. But once bitten, the gardening bug tends to stay with us for the rest of our lives. And for one gardener, that's been quite a long time. Derek Saunders has been gardening since he was a boy, which is an awfully long time because he's an incredible 97 years old and has got to be one of the UK's oldest gardeners.
I was born only 18 months after the First World War. In those days, everybody had a garden, and it was incumbent upon the father to put food on the table, really. My father allowed me to sow seeds and do all that sort of thing. I always complained I was a bit heavy-handed with the seeds, but never mind, he tolerated me, shall I say.
Wow, what a healthy crop.
When I was first married, my father gave me some seed called scarlet runners, and I saved that seed for 20, 25 years.
Really?
Never bought any seed. And since I've had these, I suppose 15 years, I've never bought any seed either.
What variety is this?
These are Wisley Magic. Once you've found something that suits your soil, it's imperative that you carry on with them because not every variety necessarily suits your soil. But these, I find, do very well indeed.
What kind of gardening is it that you like best?
Well, I love vegetables most of all. I mean, I love flowers as well, but I always maintain you can't eat flowers, so they're secondary in my thoughts. It's so fascinating, and still is, that, you know, you sow those seeds, and what eventually comes out of a packet of seed is absolutely wonderful. Never ceases to amaze me, really.
So, Derek, these are your prized tomatoes, your favourites.
That's quite true.
And you've got your marigold plant at the bottom.
They give off quite a pungent odour, and I plant 2 of those each year, one here and one at the other end. And throughout the years, I've never had any problem with green fly or black fly.
That's amazing. Real proof for companion planting really works.
Really does, yes, yes. I'm not sure about these black ones. I've never seen them before.
They're quite incredible looking, though, aren't they?
Well, they do look very attractive, but I don't know what they're like to taste.
Are there any ripe? Can we try?
Oh, we'll try one of those and cut it open.
Do you mind if I try a bit?
Oh, no, of course. Taste is no different, really, is it?
It's quite nice, though.
Yeah.
Will you grow it again next year?
Possibly. To me, tomatoes are red, and that's end of story.
Derek looked after his garden by himself until he was 95. Over the last couple of years, he's had a little help. Hi, Kevin.
Hello there.
So what's it like really working for Derek then?
It's brilliant, it's excellent. He's a lovely chap, he's got a lot of energy, and he keeps me on my toes.
Yeah. Must be quite high pressure working for someone who's been doing it so long.
Well, it is a job to try and, make it look as good as Derek would.
Any tips that you've learned from him?
Well, since I've been working for Derek, I didn't even know what a gourd was, let alone varnish them.
He varnishes his gourds.
He varnishes gourds. And he varnishes them for Christmas.
Oh, nice, to preserve them.
Decoration, and, I think he gives a lot away.
Quite nice. Well, I won't keep you from hedge cutting or the boss. It might get cross.
Yeah, thank you.
Five years ago, I had a major operation, and I'm sure that gardening helped to restore my health and mind and spirit, quite honestly, and there's a contributory factor, there's no doubt about that.
In a lifetime of gardening such as yours, you must have seen so many changes.
Yes, there has been many, many changes, of course there has, but the old methods still hold good today, as I learned them from my father 80 and 90 years ago. And you've still got to get your shoulder behind the spade and the hoe, which is very important, and tackle it daily. And the trick is to keep on top of it, because if it gets out of hand, it then becomes a chore. And when it becomes a chore, it's not a pleasure.
I understand that you watch Gardener's World and you have a message for Monty.
Yes, I very much appreciate when he does his jobs for the weekend, because it acts as an aid memoir, and if I haven't done it, I know I've got to get off my bottom and get out there and get on with it to catch up with him.
Well, I think you're doing a pretty good job from what I can see.
Yeah.
Well, Derek, thank you very much for showing me your garden.
My pleasure.
You really are living proof that gardening is great for the body and for the soul.
Well, I don't think it's a question of you keeping up with me, Derek. I think it's a question of the rest of us struggling to keep up with you. And don't worry, I've got some jobs lined up. But not for a moment, because first of all, I want to prune my raspberries, but not these autumn ones. These are at their very best. They're covered with fruit. We're picking them almost daily, and they should go on producing fruit for at least another month. But summer fruiting ones, which are in the row behind, are very different, because they produce their fruit on the canes that were grown the previous year. So therefore, the pruning of them has to be quite specific, and if you get it wrong, you have no fruit at all. You can see very clearly the different growths here. These are new shoots produced this spring and summer. They've got a nice pink colour and they're fresh. And importantly, they're not tied in. They're growing loose. Whereas the canes that produce the fruit in late June and July, I tied in last September. They're already starting to get brown. You can see the foliage is dying back. They've done their job. They're no use to me anymore. So I need to remove all these tied-in canes and then select the best of the new growth and tie those in so they're ready for winter. And the reason you tie them in is partly to protect them, because they are rather brittle and can snap in winter winds, and also to make it easier to pick the fruit. So having removed the old canes, I now need to thin the new ones. So I've got a really good selection of strong, straight, vigorous shoots which will bear next year's crop. So for example, this here, immediately I'm going to remove because it's too small, it's not doing the stuff, so that can come out. Now at this stage, I want to start tying it in, and what you're trying to do is fan them out. So each cane is equidistant from the other, each with air around it, and each so it's dead easy just to pick the fruit off. And that's it, that's all you have to do for them. And raspberries are one of those fruits that any garden can grow. But of course, the range of plants that we can grow is probably much greater than many of us realise. And at RHS Wisley, they have created a brand new exotic garden with a huge range of plants. And Adam went along to have a look.
I'm here at RHS Wisley in the new exotic garden. As soon as I walked in, it's put a massive smile on my face. It took me back to being like a 16-year-old kid in North Devon Parks Department. So many of the plants, you know, I recognise. We used to use them in bedding schemes, and I cannot wait to find out a little bit more about it.
Positioned where the Jubilee Rose Garden once stood, it's been a year in the making, and it's been created to showcase a vast array of exotic planting that is possible to grow in the UK. It's certainly a feast for the eyes, with hundreds of varieties from across the world. Emma Allen was project manager, in charge of it all.
Why an exotic garden? You know, this was a rose garden.
It was indeed. It was a monoculture of roses, so we only had roses in here. Next door, we've got a really big rose garden, even larger, that's mixed with herbaceous perennials and shrubs. So it felt like we had two offers of roses. And previously, we've had subtropical borders and beds, but they've been maybe next to oak trees. It's looked a bit incongruous. And we've never had that all-immersive exotic garden experience. So although some of the plants are quite small at the moment, they are going to get very big. And the idea is these paths we're walking on now, in the next few years, will start to become more and more enclosed, and you won't be able to see what's around the corner.
It's got a central feature and then a series of rings, but they're broken, more or less into sort of quarters and thirds, aren't they?
That's right. And every area has got its own kind of planting style and feel to it.
The different sections come together really well, and the plant selection is adventurous. As I walk through the garden, it's the detail in the way the plants are being maintained that I've really noticed.
One of the things that stood out for me is some of their pruning methods and what they've done to get the best out of the plants. Look at this Trachycarpus. You know, some people are really put off by these plants because of this old husk that really looks quite scruffy. But what they've done here is actually, as it's grown up, what they've done is peeled it down and cut it off with this sharp knife to expose this absolutely sort of stunning bark. And sat in a border or even actually by itself would make a fantastic focal point. Do you know, this is another one that caught my eye. It's tree dahlia, which is Dahlia imperialis, and this is normally covered in leaves. And what they've done actually by accident is when they planted it, some of these lower leaves got damaged, so they've really cleaned the stem up. And they've exposed this beautiful bark that's got like a limey finish on it. I think it sort of says that maybe sometimes don't just accept plants for what they are. You know, you can manipulate them and change them into something so that they work for you. With so much wonderful planting on display, it's Matthew Pottage who has the task of curating this array of tropical treats. Give me an idea, in a sense, what people could take home from the garden.
Well, first of all, we want a big dollop of inspiration and wow factor. So we want them to walk in here and be hooked and think, wow, you know, what could we take away from this? There's lots of small beds in here with small groupings of plants, so people can get a smaller scale. But also, I think for them to realise that you can put what might be considered a traditional hardy plant like hibiscus or fatsia, put it among some more exotic-looking bedding, beauty lawns or cannas, or a hardy palm, and actually the effect is really different. One thing that is a complete experiment in here, but it's absolutely gorgeous, is Erebotria deflexa. Deflexa has a lovely coppery red young foliage and a lovely toothed leaf. That is really beautiful. And I do have a bit of a soft spot for conifers. And there's a few conifers crept in here, but conifers that you might not see every day. They're not like your cypress types. They're not like Chamaecyparis types. We've got a few pines with long needles, a few really wacky cryptomerias in here. You know, conifers are exotic, and mixed into this planting, suddenly it's just another way of using a plant that you might think, oh, hang on, I wouldn't have thought of that.
So you are in a lovely warm part of the country, beautiful free-draining soil. I'm in Lincolnshire. Winds, cold, can be, clay soil, but actually further north than me, you know, it gets even colder. Yeah. So now if I want to go on that exotic journey, what would you suggest that I put in?
One of my real key favourites, and we've planted quite a lot of them in here, is Trachycarpus wagnerianus. It's a smaller leafed, it's a Chisholm palm, it's very, very hardy. It's got a much smaller, tougher leaf than your regular Trachycarpus, and they don't get shredded up by winds. But I think the thing is, with something like that, start to get to know your space, your garden. You know, position things against the south-facing wall, dig in lots of sand and grit at planting times. And even, you know, if you've got an old house and you've got single glazing, that leaks heat, air bricks, sometimes central heating outlets. They just make, even if it's just a few degrees difference, they are worth just thinking about for 2 minutes. And believe it or not, when you're wrapping things up in the winter, people are often tempted to use plastic and bubble wrap. You know, that just seals in more moisture. It doesn't allow for airflow. So think dry, but think air circulation too.
Matt was talking about Erebotria deflexa, which is probably a slightly more tender plant. This is Erebotria japonica, but for me, it's probably more reliable and one that I'd have a go with. But if you're living in colder conditions, you could grow this in a pot. You could protect it in the winter, but structure-wise, it's stunning. You know, lovely leathery leaves, look good in a border. Cracking plant. You know, looking around this garden makes you realise what an array of plants there is out there with that really tropical feel. But if you don't know a lot about them and maybe you just want to introduce one or two to the garden, the one I pick out would be the canna. And you look at the leaves, you've got this wonderful sort of mix of colours. You've got green, you've got dark red, you've got variegation. Then you go on to the flowers. Beautiful, stunning oranges, yellows, reds. And then you've got the seed pod, which carries you sort of through to the back end of the season. So for me, it would have to be the canna.
Well, the garden is now open to the public, so do go along and see it. I can't wait to get over to Wisley myself, and you can find details on opening times and directions at our website. Now, I have to agree with Adam. Cannas are fantastic, and I grow a number of different kinds here in the Jewel Garden. But I think that this banana out-tops the biggest and best canna you can have. This is fantastic. It is the Insetti Ventricosum morellii, and this year, this particular plant has grown twice as big as I've ever had it before. And it's worth pointing out that exotic plants don't have to be tender. I mean, this will need taking indoors and storing as soon as it gets cold. But you can have exotic plants that are fully hardy. It's just a question of using imagination and working in with the conditions in your own garden. But wherever your garden is, there are always jobs to do, and this week, I dedicate our jobs to you, Derek Saunders. Now is a good time to give box, hedges or topiary a final trim. Whether you use shears or hedge cutters, it's a good idea to have a bucket of water to dip the blades into to stop them gumming up. And I always add a splash of disinfectant to sterilize them. Resist the temptation to cut too hard, but just give a light trim all over, and that will keep it crisp throughout the winter. A few weeks ago, I sowed the ornamental carrots Olea and Ami. And now is the time to prick them out. If you leave them in the seed tray, they'll stop growing. Whereas, however small they are, if you prick them out into plugs or small pots now, they will quickly become big enough to plant out into the garden at the end of October. Having pricked them out, water them, put them to one side, and make sure they don't dry out. It's been a good year for courgettes, but they do have a habit of growing enormous in the blink of an eye, and you must keep cutting them. Better to have them sausage-sized than a socking grape marrow, and this will also extend their season. What you do in the garden and when you do it is dictated as much as anything else by the weather. So let's see what's in store for us gardeners this weekend.
Good evening. It's time to start thinking about what you're going to do with those tender plants when the frosts arrive. It might be time to start getting the covers ready, or even to begin bringing things indoors, because some of us could see a touch of frost at least this weekend. Showers easing as the weekend goes on, some spells of sunshine, but some decidedly chilly nights. Quite a chilly start to Saturday. Showers from the word go across eastern England, parts of Wales and the southwest of England, and even where we start off dry with some sunshine, the cloud will tend to bubble up and some showers will break out through the afternoon. Although northern Scotland probably turning drier, fewer showers by the end of the day, more in the way of sunshine. But plenty of showers for Northern Ireland, Northern England, down into the Midlands and across East Anglia and the southeast. If you are planning to get out into the garden, some of the showers could be heavy, possibly thundery. Generally pretty cool as well across Wales, the southwest for instance, 13 or 14 degrees. But as we go on through Saturday night, the showers will start to fade. There'll be clear skies, perhaps the odd fog patch, and this is where we could get a touch of frost. Probably not in the centre of the big towns and cities, but out in the countryside, cold enough for a grass frost, maybe even an air frost across some sheltered parts of Scotland. Into Sunday, actually fewer showers. This is the day to get out and about if you do have jobs to do. More in the way of dry weather, some spells of sunshine, lighter winds, but temperatures still struggling. Highs of 15 to 18 degrees.
Come on. We've had rain, we've had dark skies, we've had lovely sunshine. And what you do get, despite all these changes in weather at this time of year, constantly, is some of the best light of the year. That rather fragile but bright light that September always brings. But no more time today. I'll be back here at Longmeadow at the same time next week. So until then, in the lovely September light, bye-bye.
A satirical swipe at the last 7 days coming up. The new series of Mock the Week continues here on BBC Two next.